Just a way of getting started here to put things into context, I'm going to be drawing my lessons from three different points. First of all, is my own personal experience, having grown up on a small farm in rural Zimbabwe in the 80s and experiencing agriculture firsthand. Second is probably from an academic point of view. I've been in academia for the last 20 years, studying these things and reviewing literature from multiple sources across the globe. And thirdly, I did spend about 2 years working with Africa Development Bank, where we made significant investments in topics related to food security and agriculture across the entire African continent as part of the Feed Africa strategy. So I'm quite indeed honored to be part of this excellent panel that's talking about issues that I think are pertinent and of extreme importance to the world today. Indeed, the nexus between technology, climate resilience, and agri-food systems, these are things that we hear about every day, but they're often talked about in isolation. I'm hoping that out of the conversation that we're having here today, we'll be able to see the connections between these items and be able to see how they connect to each other's systems and how we can solve them collectively together. Let me start with just the lay of the land on all those three different areas. What is the status of the global food system today? The picture that we hear is not a very good one. I was looking up the statistics today from the UN World Food Program's Live Hunger Map, and it aggregates that about 957 million people in 93 countries do not have enough food to eat. That's a lot of people, almost a billion. It also says that they are from the global humanitarian outlook, that it projects that 239 people are in need of life-saving humanitarian action as projected this year. This is people who are really in extreme hunger, who are going to bed without food. So we do know that agriculture and food systems are facing a crisis. And we've known this for a while. This is not news to anybody who works in these circles. The second crisis we're facing relates to climate change. Again, we're seeing things over the news, but it's worth putting some numbers to it. The frequency of weather-related disasters has increased by 46% from 2007 to 2016 compared to the same period in the 1990s. All this is due to climate change. These climate disasters are resulting in about 60,000 deaths annually, and most of these deaths are actually occurring in developing countries. Partly, there's just a high incidence of those events in some of these places, but the lack of preparedness by most of the populations in those countries makes them extremely vulnerable to these kind of changes and disasters. The third leg here we're talking about is technology. And this is where it gets exciting. There's a lot of positive things to say there. We're living in an unprecedented world of innovation. Digital technologies are transforming the world everywhere we look, in finance, in education, in food systems, and agriculture. And I'm excited to say that this is a technology that has really shown rapid penetration in developing countries. The rapid adoption of the cell phone, increasing adoption of the mobile cell phone, affordability of bandwidth, and all this continuous innovation is really spurring a new wave of technologies that bear a lot of potential. We're yet to see the strong evidence to that, but there's quite a lot to be hopeful about. The innovations that we're seeing, they span all the way, the entire span of the agri-value chain, from research and breeding programs into new crops and animals, to traceability along the agricultural value chain, to food processing, technologies, post-harvest loss. All these things, there's so much exciting innovation that's taking place across this entire ecosystem. And these give us hope that we have new tools to address some of the old challenges. The last one, maybe that's worth mentioning here, is really is what is in front of all of us this year or over the last 1.5 years. That's the COVID-19 pandemic. These things were already challenging before the pandemic hit. But now we live in a new, interesting time where the entire food system and any other system for that matter has been challenged by this new pandemic that is COVID-19. It is now teaching us that in addition to just meeting the needs of today, all systems need to be resilient enough to be able to withstand shocks, so that food systems do not only need to feed us today, but we need them to be ready to feed us tomorrow when we expect new and different shocks. That could be from a pandemic, could be weather related, or could be war and conflict. We need systems that can offer that kind of resilience so that we're still able to feed people even in the most extreme conditions. All this is to say that we need to recalibrate public policies, research priorities, and private sector investments so that we can continue to meet these changing needs and continue to be able to hit that moving target.
My work generally focuses on supporting the investments in and advancement of aquatic food systems. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about aquatic food systems today. And I think it's so important to account for them because they have such an important role to play in addressing issues of climate resilience within agri-food systems. So aquatic foods themselves, from fin fish to shellfish and other types of aquatic plants and animals, to the entire food system within which they operate, have a significant contribution to make to climate resilience, and technology is really accelerating that. I'll give just a few examples of how aquatic foods respond to and contribute to climate resilience, as well as the role technology is playing within this food system. First is that aquatic foods offer some of the most significant potential in terms of foods and food systems that really are very climate friendly. We have aquatic foods that produce just a fifth of the kind of greenhouse gas emissions coming from production systems of other animal protein. You have aquatic food systems that contribute significantly to sequestering carbon, and you have aquatic food systems that really are able to fully utilize byproducts of other agricultural production, therefore minimizing waste and loss within the environment. Now, so these are again just a few examples of how aquatic foods are very promising in terms of the ability to contribute to climate resilience. And it's so pertinent because one of the things we've seen is from the original Green Revolution, we sort of waited a bit too long before really adapting food systems for climate resilience. And aquatic foods offer us the opportunity now to adapt existing food systems, especially in places like Africa, to become more climate resilient even as they expanded. Digital technologies have a very interesting role to play in all of this. First is in the role of just improving the supply chain and addressing existing problems within aquatic foods, including food waste and loss and proper management of aquatic food resources. To give an example, there are now digital solutions that allow communities, countries, governments and beyond to track their fisheries, to understand what's happening with the aquatic food resources. And these are very important, especially in a world where some fish stocks have been significantly diminished. Secondly, you also have technologies helping a range of stakeholders, from technologies that help smallholder farmers within aquatic food systems to track diseases, to technologies that help to minimize waste and loss of aquatic foods. All of these really matter in the ability to deliver stronger and more resilient systems. So overall, again, you're going to hear me talk quite a bit about the aquatic foods perspective, just because they offer a very unique angle to this question, and they have quite a lot to contribute, and more light needs to be shined on that area.
Technology, climate resilience, and agri-food systems. Three intriguing topics that we're addressing here. So firstly, many thanks to the organizers for drawing attention to these important topics and for inviting me to contribute to this event. It is fantastic that Canadian institutions are reaching out to Africa to increase international collaboration on the urgency of climate change and also how it will affect investments in agricultural systems and in technology. These technological investments are much needed for both societal and environmental goals. But first, Titi, allow me to start with some reflections on context and maybe a few statistics to help guide us. Canada, as we know, is a large country, almost 1 billion hectares in size, although Africa is more than 3 times larger than Canada. And Africa has a population 30 times larger than Canada. Now, somewhat surprisingly, Africa's GDP, though, is only 1.5 times bigger than that of Canada. So, in economic terms, agriculture accounts for less than 2% of Canada's GDP, whereas in Africa, it is 25%. Now, to technology. In total, Canada spends 4 times as much each year on R&D than the whole of Africa. Let me repeat that. In total, Canada spends 4 times as much each year on research and development than the whole of Africa. And in Canada, 1/4 of that funding comes from government sources, whereas 3/4 of that funding in Africa comes from governments. So, geographical context aside, what are some key priorities for international collaboration for Canada and Africa? And likely, as the other speakers have already highlighted, top amongst these priorities surely must be climate change. Now, as we know, Africa has the lowest per capita emissions and the lowest historical emissions of greenhouse gases. Yet, it is predicted to be amongst the worst affected by climate change. And much of this negative impact will be felt within agricultural systems and rural land use, as Ed pointed out. The organization that I'm privileged to lead, namely C4ICRAF, has been working in Africa for over 40 years, with a headquarters in Kenya and activities with national institutions in over 30 countries in Africa. With the African continent being the most rural, the poorest, the most vulnerable to climate change, and the least forested, we focus on 5 key challenges of preventing deforestation and biodiversity loss, addressing the climate crisis, transforming food systems, making supply and value chains sustainable, and lastly, tackling inequality and inequity. Now, one startling feature of the African continent, unlike our panel, is the young age of its population. While this may pose some challenges for African countries, it also affords great possibilities. Indeed, 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25 years. So a key part of the solution has got to be youth and jobs for the youth. Now, apart from the demographic infrastructure of Africa, what are the infrastructures needed? So perhaps most of our audience are either baby boomers or Generation X or millennials. And we as a group saw massive physical infrastructure built in all countries around the world. The roads, the dams, the skyscrapers. But what infrastructure will African youth need? And as important as transport and housing and energy infrastructure in Africa is, in the next 10 years, we're going to need more green infrastructure, more digital infrastructure, and more technological infrastructure. And such infrastructure will help create the circular, the inclusive, the nature-based, and the fully costed economies much needed in the African continent to achieve the 2030 development agenda. Put most simply, technology is the application of scientific knowledge. It doesn't have to be a machine or a highly sophisticated or costly, but it does need to be of high utility and function well. And technology also has to be adapted to local contexts. So one set of very simple technologies that as C4ICRAF we didn't invent, but what we did refine for the local context was in Gagera Valley in northern Tigray. And here in the mid-1990s, the hillsides were denuded of vegetation and degraded rainfall catchment for what was 800 households. And most this was prompting government to move people off the land into towns. With Mackay University and the support of Irish Aid, we took the village leaders of Gagera to Rajasthan in India to see land restoration in practice with simple and relatively cheap technologies of things like tree planting pits, of livestock exclusion, of building check dams and constructing river gambians. In 2 decades, we saw a very devastated landscape transformed, where vegetation and birdsong replaced erosion and barren land. It was not physical capital or financial capital that transformed the agricultural system and raised the water table from 12 meters below to just 1 meter below the surface. It was social capital. And each person in the village was mandated to work 40 days in the watershed voluntarily, at their own free will, but voluntarily to be continue being a member of that village, to build up that natural capital using technology. And these experiences are now informing a very large multi-country project that we have with the European Union called Regreening Africa, that's reaching 500,000 farmers in 8 countries in Africa. And this really, TT, highlights an additional point that technology is fairly irrelevant if it cannot be deployed at scale.
There are lots of technologies and solutions coming up that are very promising in the fact that they have the ability to solve some very critical problems for smallholder farmers and for other key stakeholders. And some of them might sort of be the usual suspects, but some you might not expect. Now, in terms of the usual suspect, you're going to hear things like some of the latest apps, for example, that enable farmers and other stakeholders to access the latest market information services. And there's been quite a lot of work to show that access to market information can make a difference for smallholders. Within aquatic food systems, it's especially important because aquatic foods are not like some crops which can be stored for months. These typically have to be sold within a short time period after harvest or after production. Otherwise, they go to waste. So it's even more pertinent and more promising that these kinds of solutions exist in that space. So those are some of the more sort of traditional or the more expected suspects from the digital solutions list. But I also like to highlight some of the more unexpected places where we're seeing interesting work and innovations within the digital space. One thing I think people don't expect is when they hear about the sheer number of stakeholders, especially farmers and other poorer stakeholders within food systems, including aquatic food systems, that are engaged through digital platforms such as Facebook and such as WhatsApp. These are sites of really active work, information, knowledge dissemination, and learning by these. And a lot of these have been very organic, have been developed very organically. So it's going to be so important for people to also recognize what is happening in these platforms that some people might traditionally overlook as sites of convergence for farmers. And so we have some people now looking into, building off of, for example, a very large and active group of farmers on Facebook. Can you build, for example, a WhatsApp bot off of that responds to the needs of those farmers, that answers their urgent questions, that links them to buyers, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the more interesting things happening on the digital side. But again, I'd like to say finally that digital technologies also have a link to some of the non-digital technologies that Tony really emphasized earlier. When you talk about some of the core technologies that even without a digital link can be widely disseminated, like improved varieties of fish or so on and so forth. These are really, you can think of them as foundational technologies, because a lot of other solutions, a lot of other businesses, a lot of other opportunities can be built off of their mere presence. And we really have to emphasize some of these foundational technologies that then allow us to build out the ecosystem. So I will also always emphasize, yes, let's sort of identify the digital technologies and that sort of are very promising, and there's a lot of potential for them to scale and to be developed through sustainable business models. But also let's think about those which are more foundational and just really enable the significant proliferation of many other opportunities across the value chain. there are significant lessons, although it focuses on aquaculture and fisheries, there are significant lessons for other value chains. So first, when you think about climate resilience, I think I mentioned this in my opening remarks, that simply by the nature of the way they exist, you have some aquatic foods or some components of the aquatic food systems that are very climate friendly, right? You have aquatic food systems whereby, when properly maintained, actually sequester carbon. You have aquatic foods that have a much lower environmental footprint compared to other ways of producing animal protein. And that can be very important because a vast majority of the world's poor continue to need animal protein. They will need some form of animal protein for the foreseeable future. And so you want to find some of the most climate friendly ways of producing them. And aquatic foods, both finfish and shellfish, among other aquatic plants and animals, are some of the most climate friendly ways of delivering protein to the world's poor. So you sort of have that, but also you have aquatic food systems that really support the climate through their ability to minimize waste and minimize unnecessary use of resources. For example, scientists have developed systems whereby everything within that aquatic food system is recycled and regenerated. From the water that is used to produce fish, being used, for example, to feed farms or home gardens, and those home gardens produce food, to methods for successfully producing more than one type of species within one system. This is called polyculture. So these are just a few examples of how, by sheer design, by sheer nature, aquatic foods and aquatic food systems are very climate resilient, and additional work on them, additional research, additional investment, additional development and scale allows us to even identify more opportunities to make them so. I think that it's going to be so important to invest in these kinds of systems in response to the climate crisis we face. It's clear that our current food production system, which is a very big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, cannot continue without major changes. And so I really have to emphasize that aquatic foods and aquatic food systems are really able to play a big role in that change, both by the nature of their existence and also through the way they can be very well integrated into other systems, very well integrated into some crop production systems, very well integrated into systems managed by small and medium and poor producers who might not have access to some of the latest technology.
I think one of the key areas that has been highlighted is the need for Africa to close the yield gap. For every unit of land and water, Africa produces much less than the rest of the world. In some cases, up to less than a quarter of what the rest of the world is producing. So one of the key areas that Africa needs to make advancements in is to actually use improved varieties for the production of new crops and new animals. I do happen to work in the space of improved seed, and I do believe that seed is the software that powers, the cropping system across Africa. And unfortunately, less than 30% of Africans are using improved varieties, and we need to be able to improve that number so that by using new varieties, farmers can have higher yield, they can have access to better nutrition in crops, they can also have pest resistance and disease resistance, and all these other needs that can come from just changing the software for farming. The second technology would be the cell phone itself. I do believe that the modern day cell phone has the power to transform smallholder agriculture across the continent. And in Africa, you're now having about 85% mobile phone penetration. We're talking about a technology that in the 80s and 90s was almost non-existent. And within these 2 decades, you're talking about those levels of penetration. Through your cell phone, or through a cell phone rather, smallholder farmers can access some of the latest research information across the world, including extension service, rural financing, microfinance, and it's what's been mentioned by Faridah. The social networks are allowing farmers to have a peer-to-peer system where they can get the latest information from WhatsApp and Facebook from farmers next door. So let me just stop there for now.
One of the many new phrases or terms being applied in the agricultural space. We've got other terms, TEEB agri-food, regenerative agriculture, boosting soil, organic carbon, agroecology, green infrastructure, ecosystem-based approaches, there's many. So nature-based solutions is a term that recognizes that essentially natural and self-sustaining processes involving biodiversity and ecosystem services and also the abiotic natural resources of our world are under-recognized and under-leveraged in their ability to support our societal goals. So in terms of supporting a vibrant agricultural production system or healthy urban and rural diets, this means providing diverse agroecological conditions to enable a diversity of crops and livestock to thrive, both spatially and temporally. And furthermore, it means the provisioning of variable combinations of production goods and services, light, substrate, water, nutrients, symbioses, pollination, pest control, and thus practices and technologies that seek to, if you like, homogenize or attain expedient uniformity run counter to this approach. So certainly we cannot control nature, but we can protect, restore, and manage it better with the right technologies. And I learned a wonderful term today from Faridah, foundational technologies. And here we've developed a smartphone app for tree planting across Africa, where you can stand in a field and it will tell you the species that are native in that area, the ones that will grow, the ones for fruit, for timber, for medicine, for boundaries. So these type of technologies, they don't mean the end of single cropping in a plot or a field, but it should end the idea that widespread monocropping is not the solution. And an end to widespread monocropping that requires ever-increasing external and artificial inputs. So, you know, we have to recognize that humans we're addicted to salt and fat and sugar as much as monocrops are addicted to fertilizers, pesticides, and plant growth regulators. And naturally, for our own health and the health of the planet, these addictions need to stop, and technology can really help us.
Digital ag is kind of this new shining toy that everybody's quite excited about. But there's some key questions to be raised here. Can this really transform the livelihoods of smallholder farmers, Mrs. Banda, in rural Malawi? I would like to say the answer is yes and no. So let me start with the yes part. You know, agriculture, you know, crops and animals are very, very old, you know, kind of systems or professions. Plants still need water to grow. They need fertilizer. They need manure. They need all these inputs. Digital ag does not deliver those. You're not going to farm a piece of land using a cell phone. So it's important to know that digital agriculture can only be an enabler for things that are basic things, foundational issues that are required in agriculture. So one cannot put all their hopes on the digital agricultural space. You still need to deliver fertilizer, you need to get mechanization, you need irrigation, you need good extension services. All these things are still required. So by itself, digital agriculture cannot transform agriculture. Here's the yes part. For the first time, we have a technology here that is not a scale, that is much more scale neutral, which means that even the small farmer in rural areas has the same access to information as a big commercial farmer in other parts of the world. Almost all other technologies that have done well in agriculture have tended to favor big commercial agriculture. So the yes part is that for the first time, we have a tool that can cut across so many different challenges that smallholder farmers face. This includes, for example, financing. Farmers, most of them are unbankable, but for the first time now, they can get financial services through a service such as M-Pesa. You can get market information services. It used to be that you needed to travel distances just to find out what prices are fetching in the market. You can get that instantaneously through WhatsApp. You needed to have coordination mechanism, access to buyers and sellers. All that information is now available to farmers. Digital protection shows up. Work together in an ecosystem to deliver value and service to the smallholder farmers across the continent.
Investment within agri-food systems generally across the spectrum, across the sort of research and development spectrum, I think it is a bit common to find these investments going in a bit of a disjointed manner. So sometimes you find significant investments in research, but no investment in actually scaling the knowledge coming out of that research. Or you find significant investment in scaling something that might look exciting or promising, but the evidence base is a bit weak for the ability of these technologies or these solutions to actually deliver the impact that is desired. So I will say first that it's so important to think about investments across the spectrum. Ideally, many agri-food systems, as well as some of the most promising technologies and solutions within agri-food systems, need investment across the spectrum. You need to be investing in some research. You need to be investing in figuring out how to scale it. You need to be investing in scaling. You need to be investing in finding out the right business models and the right dissemination models for scaling. You need to invest in figuring out if you've actually delivered impact with this technology. So first, I will say in each of these areas, there are significant opportunities for scale. Now, I'll select two. I'll select the investments needed at the research point, at the production point of this innovation and solution, as well as investment needed in disseminating it. You see that these are some of the two weakest parts. So you see, for example, that some food systems, and here I'm talking one of them being aquatic food systems, are significantly underfunded in terms of the needs, research needs. There is so much left to know about these food systems. We know only a small fraction of what there is to know. And the knowledge we do not know is really important to our ability to transform these systems. So I'll emphasize that there are a range of really priority research needs that can help us deliver many of our goals, whether these are bilateral, whether these are for multiple countries, and so on and so forth. And then on the scaling side, I would say there are some of the exciting, promising technologies, but it's often hard to scale them because we've not yet figured out what's the way to do this in a viable manner, through a sustainable business model, through something that might not need donor funding forever. So it's also worthwhile to consider investing both in disseminating some of these very promising technologies, as well as figuring out the best business models, the most viable way of making sure that these things can scale by their sheer promise.
Recognizing that in the past few decades, Canada has been incredibly generous in its development assistance to Africa, that the future needs to be a better integration of public and private sector investments. Let's remind ourselves that for every dollar of ODA in developing countries, there's $3 of remittances from the diaspora. There's $6 of foreign direct investment. There's $25 of local private sector spend, and $36 of developing country government spend. But on top of all of that, for every dollar of ODA, there's $2,000 of private capital that needs to be mobilized and invested. So in addressing technology and international cooperation, it needs to be much more about involving private sector and private investors. So from the private sector, everything from multinational traders and manufacturers through to the SMEs in country. And private investors who see that the de-risking that public sector co-financing can bring to their credit and equity and guarantee and grant financial instruments. So, we've really got to change the mindset that public goods don't mean private bads, and private goods don't mean public bads. We need to better link these public goods and private interests across all technology categories of IT, of soil enhancements, biological solutions, genetic improvement, and geospatial instrumentation.
The magic of this is that we have to grow this pie before we can cut it up. There's so much win-win solutions out there. So the more we make efficient the agricultural value chain, the food system in Africa, there's going to be winners all the way from the farmer to the consumer and everybody in between. So we can all benefit from a system that is producing more and is much more efficient. So the first answer, part of that answer is that there is a lot of win-win situations before we even get to recommuning. Now, getting back to that, really who is going to lose? There will be some people. Every technology indeed brings winners and losers. Digital technologies, to me, in African value chain, there's been a lot of inefficiencies due to asymmetric information. Just to go and buy, a smallholder farmer goes to the market and they try to sell their grain or their tomatoes. Most likely the buyer there has much more access to information on market prices than the smallholder farmer does. So all those people who I would call rent seekers, who are just not adding much value along the value chain, but they were just brokers who are making profit out of thin air, are likely to lose in the long term. And that will create, to me, hopefully, a more affordable product at the end for for consumers, and a higher price for the farmer at the beginning of that food chain. But every value chain in Africa is unique. Every country is unique. And these things also change by season. So you'll find winners and losers. And after the dust is settled, I hope that we'll have what will emerge out of this will be a much more stronger, more resilient, more efficient agri-food system that serves both the needs of the farmer, but also the needs of the consumer and the industry.
Thanks also to the organizers for putting together such an exciting program. Closing thoughts. Listening to Ed and Faridah, I was reminded of theories of change. You know, these are the new log frames that we used to work on decades ago. So theories of change come in different formats. Theory of observed change, trying to understand the world. Theory of induced change, of our investments and our interventions changing the world, the impact pathways, and theory of contextual change, of how one place affects some generic understanding. And technology's got to respond to all three of those theories of change, but most importantly, the theory of induced change. And here we've got to put a lot more attention on monitoring, on making sure that the investments that we're making are true and accurate and best reported. Most importantly, we've got to invest in science. If technology is the application of scientific knowledge, then we've got to invest much, much more in science, in research and development. And yes, a lot of capacity has been built in Africa. And in these places, it's not about capacity building, but capacity mobilization, of making sure that we have the resources to use those competencies and capacities and skills and expertise in African countries. We've got to engage youth. They are the future, but they also need to be much more of the present. At the moment, Africa imports about $40 billion a year worth of food. And you know, which country in Africa would really struggle to produce enough food? Very few. So the African Development Bank predicts that that's going to be $130 billion by 2030. So that import substitution of looking to make sure that Africa can feed itself and use technology to not just leap ahead, but to catch up in terms, as Ed spoke about, that yield dividend. Yeah, essentially, does Africa want to be a customer, or does it want to be a provider to the rest of the world? We spoke a little bit about finance in this topic, but it will take finance, and we have to make sure that finance is not paramount. Finance is not necessarily in charge. It's a means to help us get somewhere. So yes, we want something to be financially viable, but it also has to be technically feasible and operationally deliverable and environmentally sustainable, and most important in Africa, politically and socially acceptable. So let's continue this conversation. Let's move to action beyond just ideas, and really look forward to the follow-up from this conference. And thanks again to the panelists and to the organizers for shining a spotlight on technology in Africa for climate resilience and transforming agri-food systems?
I think I'll make 2 points to round up my remarks in this panel. First, on the digital question or the digital side of the equation, and second, on the climate resilience side of the equation. I will say that on the digital side of the equation, something very important for as many stakeholders as possible to look at is using digital tools, digital solutions, digital technology as a way to bring together other technologies and other solutions. Very often you find people who sort of see digital technologies as this moonshot, the only way to get us out of the problems. And it's very rare to find that kind of digital technology. You often have to combine it with a lot of other things. There are very, very few moonshots generally. And so it will be so important for us to be able to think about how can we use digital technologies really more as a platform, as a connecting tool, as a point of synergy for the many other very promising technologies and solutions that can transform our agri-food systems. I leave all members of our audience with that question. And secondly would be to look to the non-traditional suspects to really help us deliver on climate resilience. I think very often we look to the very traditional suspect, especially, for example, commercial crops, and we're trying to deliver all our impact through there. And yes, these are important, especially because they're widely consumed, but there is so much promise and so much potential and ability to deliver climate resilience in the non-traditional suspects, such as, of course, aquatic foods, but not just there. For example, some of our indigenous crops and vegetables, which are really underutilized, under-researched, under-invested in, under-consumed, underproduced. These are significant areas of promise for us to deliver climate resilience through agri-food systems in Africa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join this discussion today.
I have a favorite quote that was said a few years back by a very prominent economist. He said that it's not sufficient, and I'm paraphrasing here, there's not sufficient resources in the world to cope with the growing population. And at some point soon we'll have to face this situation where, basically we will not be able to feed ourselves. These words were said by Thomas Malthus, and the year was 1867. I'm bringing them here today because for as long as we can remember, at least in my field in economics, there's been a prediction that, look, we are facing what they've called a Malthusian crisis. The reason that this didn't happen in the 1800s is because human beings have been able to continuously innovate and develop technologies that allow us to produce more food on the sub-unit planet. Yes, there's an upper limit to that, but I'm always amazed by how much we can push that further. So in my closing, I want to make three separate points. One is the need to continuously invest in research and development in new technologies that can improve the efficiency of agricultural management. Tony mentioned staggering figures here, the difference between Africa and Canada. If we can even get to half of those numbers, as said in the Malabo Declaration, more investment in agricultural R&D, Africa will be on the 80 billion. The second part is that developing technologies is just the first part. These technologies need to find their way to where they're needed the most. So we need to be able to deliver these technologies at scale to the smallholder farmers. It could be new improved varieties, it could be food storage and post-harvest loss reduction, food processing. All these technologies, they're not visible to anybody if they're sitting in journals and research shelves. They need to get out there and be deployed where they're needed the most in the time. And the last one, I want to close on a slightly more upbeat point. I think we're making progress across Africa. If you look at the numbers, we're starting to see there's more we're having investments in agricultural sector from development, government, private sector. We're making some good progress. But however, the target is moving as well. So yes, we have made significant progress since the 80s, the 90s, 2000s. But when you look at the numbers, look at Africa's growing youth power, look at climate change, look at the COVID-19 pandemic. This target is moving, and we need to continuously, like I said before, we need to recalibrate our policies, our investment priorities, our research instruments, so that we keep ourselves current. And I'm grateful for a forum like this to keep getting these ideas on board and to getting us to think not just about the challenges of yesterday, but looking towards tomorrow and how we can do it.